Alright, I'll make a video about DSBM. Good evening, my name is Dante, and welcome back to my channel. On this channel, I discuss strange and obscure media. It has been a minute since I made a video. I have been working full-time and going to school full-time, so unfortunately the concept of free time has been non-existent for me. Anyway, I've had a few people request that I do a video about DSBM in my community post, on comments on my videos, on Instagram messages, etc. Honestly, I've been pretty apprehensive about it just because I have mixed feelings about the genre, but I figured since it's been such a while since I made a video, why not talk about something that people want to hear about? That being said, this video won't specifically be just about the music genre alone, but more so my experiences with it and why I don't really listen to it as much anymore. So first and foremost, what is DSBM? And no, it's not BDSM or anything sexual or fetish related. Quite the opposite, actually. DSBM stands for Depressive Black Metal. Traditionally, black metal is often characterized by tremolo-picked guitar melodies, blast beat drums, raspy or shrieked vocals, raw productions, and an evil, infernal atmosphere. While depressive black metal takes on more dire or funereal sounding melodies, sometimes slower tempos, more desperate sounding vocals, and often lyrics about self-harm or mental illness. Its origins stem back to the mid-1990s, tracing its influences back to bands such as Streed, Forgotten Woods, Bethlehem, and even Burzum's Philosophim album. It grew a bit throughout the 2000s as bands such as Silencer, Shining, and Zasther further developed the sound into its own subgenre. Along the way, a ton of one-man bedroom projects appeared in the fold. Likewise, bands such as Life Lover and Psychonaut 4 experimented with combining elements of DSBM and post-punk, which spawned its own wave of similar artists. Then, from the 2010s to today, the rise of black gaze or post-black metal has created a lot of overlap with DSBM, with one of the more well-known examples of this being the band Ghostbath. So my journey with this style of music started back around 2010. I was a teenager in high school in a small college town. I was definitely what you would consider a loner at the time. I had some friends but didn't fit into any particular circle. So I spent most of my downtime browsing the internet, specifically metal archives and Tumblr. Yeah, I was a Tumblr teen. By that point in time, I knew I was into heavier music. I had really gotten into doom and gothic metal and had begun dabbling in death and black metal as well. It was around that time that I discovered a band known as Total Self-Hatred. These folks are a Finnish act who formed in the mid-2000s, and at that point in time, they had only released their debut album a few years prior. I had never heard of depressive black metal before then, but since a lot of the bands I was listening to at the time were gloomy or sorrowful sounding, I figured it would probably be up my alley. With what I knew about black metal at that time, the last thing I expected to hear from this band were keyboards and a clean production. So imagine my surprise when the album started with a piano intro and a crystal clear production. The riffs themselves are very melodic, with mid-tempo drumming, ghostly keyboards, and desperate screamed vocals. The clean production and fluid guitar lines remind me of the melodic death doom bands that were coming out of Europe at the time, what with October Tide, Swallow the Sun, and Saturnus. So as someone who is a fan of that niche, that definitely appealed to me. From there, I got into Forgotten Tomb, who I still enjoy to this day. Particularly, I got into the band's first two albums, Songs to Leave and Springtime Depression. Both albums are a creepy, doomy black metal that sounds claustrophobic while still utilizing a lot of melodic guitar leads. The songs No Way Out and Disheartenment from their Songs to Leave album are what I would consider to be two of the best songs to be found in the genre overall. One factor that really hooked me into those two particular tracks is the notable influence in riffing from Catatonia's second album, Brave Murder Day, which, well, that's a topic for another video. Anyway, my interest in Forgotten Tomb's discography wavers a bit after the first two albums, as I didn't feel as impacted by their work throughout the latter 2000s and 2010s. However, I find their two most recent albums, Nihilistic Estrangement and Night Floating, to be pretty strong. I think leaning more into their melodicism has worked really well for their sound. So now we get into Silencer. Probably the most talked about DSBM act on YouTube for quite a few reasons. Outside of the music itself, there has been a ton of myths and controversy surrounding the band's vocalist Mikael Nielsen, who is known under the stage name Natram. Because the lore of Natram has already been discussed extensively by quite a few creators, I'm going to just stick to discussing the music itself. I first heard Silencer's album Death Pierced Me when I was 15. And I won't lie, I thought the pictures of Natram were very creepy. Musically though, I could have taken it or left it. Silencer's music was a powerful, dramatic approach to DSBM that kept things pretty fast-paced and energetic. Apocalyptic riffs and frantic drumming alternate with solemn piano and clean guitar melodies with the unhinged vocal performance of Natram. A lot of people find Natram's high-pitched wails and screams to be terrifying and chilling, while others find it to be goofy or insufferable. I don't really have too strong of a stance on it. I can see why his vocal style was influential to other artists in black metal, but it didn't really disturb me or irritate me as strongly as it did for other listeners. What I will say is that considering how the album is hyped up as being so disturbing, I would have expected it to sound a little bit more raw than it actually is. That's not to sound like a hard ass or say, ooh, it wasn't raw enough for me. Merely, the sound and production are a lot cleaner than I would have expected from how people describe the album. For example, I previously covered the band Swordsend in one of my Not Safe for Life albums videos, and their album SAR is a lot closer to what I would have expected Death Pierce Me to sound like. Just a lot noisier, looser, less refined overall. So now on to my favorite band within this niche of music. I love Bethlehem. And I can hear the comments now. Bethlehem aren't DSBM, they're Black Doom. They're not Black Doom, they're dark metal. Whatever. I absolutely love Bethlehem. I think their first 3 albums are phenomenal, and they've made a serious comeback with One Lard this past decade. Their first album, Dark Metal, is a lumbering black and doom release with powerful, slow riffs and mid-range growls. Dark metal is perhaps the most straightforward out of the band's discography, and everything since then has been increasingly experimental and demented sounding. The album that it seems most people like to speak on is their second album, Dictius Te Necer. The approach of Dictius Te Necer seemed to be a pretty significant influence on Silencer, as stylistically the two sound pretty similar. Spastic passages of black metal drop into menacing clean guitar sections and some slower, doomier riffs on occasion, with the absolutely batshit vocal performance of Rainer Landfermann. His frantic, high-pitched screeching in German really adds to the element of lunacy throughout the album. The riffs themselves range from blistering to funereal, creating a manic-depressive Jekyll and Hyde effect. My personal favorite album from the band would be Sardanica. Actually, let's just call it This is their third album, and I consider it to be their best. While much of it is a bleak, mid-tempo form of DSBM, there are a lot of other nuances in the mix. There's a good bit of death doom influence, some post-punk inspired riffing, some avant-garde stuff. Likewise, there's a good bit of variation in the vocals as well. There are some high-pitched shrieks similar to those on Dictius Te Necer, some lower bellowing growls, some spoken female vocals. Overall, I find it to be a nuanced and eclectic album. I notice something new every time I listen to it, and I really appreciate that. The next few bands I'm going to speak on are a little bit lesser known. Tunes of Despair were an international duo who released material around the time I was really delving into the genre. They released an EP titled The Process of Leaving, followed by an album called From Beyond the Vein. One factor that initially grabbed my interest in this band was that they were the first DSBM band I knew of at the time that had a woman as the sole vocalist. Which in hindsight isn't important, but me being 16 at the time thought was super cool and unique. Anyway, their sound was a lo-fi mix of DSBM and funeral doom with fuzzy guitars, steady drumming, and lower range screams. Multi-instrumentalist Yanni Paiulati has had a handful of other projects in the DSBM genre, such as Fornicatus and Photophobia. While I remember checking out his other bands, I don't really remember them leaving as great of an impression on me as Tunes of Despair did. Of course, I'm partial to the more funeral doom-inspired passages of their music. I thought they did a great job of incorporating those alongside the faster or more mid-tempo sections that are common for DSBM. The next DSBM project that had an impact on me was Wilted. These folks were a duo from the United States who released a single album titled Echoes in My Mind. I find them similar to Tunes of Despair in that their sound is very fuzzy, sleepy, and hypnotic. One of the aspects about Wilted's sound that I appreciate was the usage of broken clean singing alongside harsh vocals. I am a sucker for clean vocals juxtaposed with extreme metal. I really enjoy the way it was done here. Both members of Wilted have had a handful of other DSBM projects, with vocalist Abe Morbid being most well known for his band Happy Days. Personally, I never really cared for Happy Days. There were a few parts of their album Cause of Death Life that I enjoy, but generally I never felt very moved by their work. One band that I really enjoyed as a teenager were Life Lover. These folks were a Swedish act whose sound was a gritty blend of DSBM and post-punk influences. Some tracks took on fuzzy, blackened riffing and screamed vocals, while others featured gloomy, clean guitars, keyboards, baritone singing, samples from movies. There was a good deal of experimentation and variety in their sound that made them influential for bands who followed in the 2010s. My personal favorite of their discography was their 2009 EP Decadence, which is perhaps the most straightforward and compact of their work. Overall, a lot of people tend to discredit Life Lover because their sound leans away from black metal as much as it does, but I always found their mix of styles interesting and wanted to make mention of them here. Another well-known DSBM band that I know people will be asking about are Shining. Shining are another Swedish act run by frontman and multi-instrumentalist Niklas Varforth. Their early albums were a gritty, straightforward take on DSBM, while over the years their sound has become a lot more melodic and refined. Admittedly, I only ever really got into their fourth and fifth albums, The Eerie Cold and Halmstad. I listened to some of their earlier albums here and there, but for whatever reason, they just didn't really grab me. Likewise, much of the stuff after Halmstad is just a bit too polished for my liking. Out of all the bands I'm discussing now, I probably should give them a second chance. Point being, they weren't one of the bands that left too great of an impact on me even back then. Xasthur, however, I can get behind some Xasthur. Xasthur is the project of Scott Connor, aka Malefic, who is a prominent figure in US black metal. I actually learned about Xasthur through Sun's album Black One, which featured Malefic on a few tracks. The primary works of Xasthur are a nightmarish, abstract, swirling type of black metal with a lot of ambience. The riffs are super hypnotic, the screams are ghastly and go heavy on the delay effects. The production is primitive and muffled, like you're listening to the music with pillows over your ears. I listened to their albums Nocturnal Poisoning and All Reflections Drained a good deal throughout my teenage years, and I can say that the shit still sounds absolutely chilling now. In fact, the latter of the two I used to put on when I would take naps just because of how blurry and ambient-based the music is. Admittedly, I haven't gotten into the more recent material, but I can definitely say that the albums from the 2000s I still enjoy to this day. One of the last bands who I listened to frequently as a teen were the one and only Make a Change Yourself. I love how direct some of these bands are with their names. This is a one-man project from Denmark, and I was into their first two albums as a teenager. Their sound is a powerful form of DSBM that mixes fast-paced riffs and dire melodies with sparse ambient passages. I find that a lot of DSBM bands tend to sound either numb, gloomy, or outright demented, whereas Make a Change's sound is very cathartic, passionate, and emotive, which I appreciate. Alright, so those are the bands I listened to when I was into the niche of DSBM. Let me emphasize, there are plenty of other bands within DSBM that I have listened to over the years, learned about, or am familiar with. The ones that I've listed are just the ones that I spent the most time with. So let me speak a bit on why I don't spend as much time with this genre anymore. This probably won't come as a surprise to you, but I have depression. Really bad depression. This was something I learned about myself shortly before getting into DSBM. I'm absolutely not going to pin any of the blame for my depression worsening on DSBM, but I don't think it helped either. It also didn't help that I was a very angsty teenager. I spent a lot of time wallowing on Tumblr along with all of the other depressed, angsty teenagers who were reblogging pictures of Kavar Forth and Kim Carlson covered in self-harm wounds. Now let me explain, it's not necessarily that listening to DSBM made me feel sadder. Rather, I got into this fun little ritual that I would get home from school around 3 or 4 p.m., head straight for my bed, put on Xasthur, Forgotten Tomb, or Life Lover on my iPod, and just sleep. Just sleep and not get up until I had to get ready for school the next day at 7 a.m. Would I have done that listening to any other genre? Probably. However, there's another aspect to this subgenre that I feel should be considered too. It is not uncommon within DSBM to promote self-harm and suicide. Who would have guessed that? While this is something you'll sometimes also see in sludge and funeral doom, it is way more common in DSBM. Pictures of musicians covered in self-harm wounds, lying in bathtubs covered in blood, nooses, razor blades, depressive stuff. Likewise, the lyrics in some of these bands can be really self-pitying. And being into the genre when I was an impressionable teenager, of course I normalized that. It's not that I find that kind of content to be offensive or triggering for me, it just isn't for me anymore. I'll keep listening to my favorites from Bethlehem, Forgotten Tomb, and Xasthur, but overall I think it's safe to say that my DSBM era has long passed. So in short, DSBM, it's not you, it's me. Anyway, that wraps up the list of DSBM bands I grew up with. I hope you enjoyed this video. I have other topics I'd like to cover soon, so hopefully you'll see me again sooner rather than later. If you liked this video, please like, comment, and subscribe. Feel free to follow me on Instagram, Rate Your Music, or Blue Sky, and send me an album you think I might be into. For now, thank you so much for watching, and I hope you have a lovely rest of your evening.